So let's talk about the Magnificat and themes that are important for this concept of dignity and respect. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is the regard for the poor and the lowly. When we look at the Magnificat, and as I've already mentioned, this concept has a really rich history in the Hebrew Bible. The poor are in some ways always the righteous poor. That can be difficult for us to get our minds around sometimes because we think that righteousness equates to salvation kind of language. For some of us as Christians, we struggle with that. It's really not that as much as it is that in some way God is on the side of the poor. And it comes out pretty clearly in the prophetic text, and I've mentioned that a little bit to you already, but it's present in the New Testament as well. The more famous, it would seem to me, maybe I'm wrong about this, but it would seem to me that the more famous version of the Beatitudes, or the sermon that begin the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, really is the Matthew version. Matthew starts with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." But Luke, in Luke chapter 6, eliminates the words "in spirit." Luke says simply, "Blessed are the poor." And that one statement betrays a kind of emphasis on the poor and on God's view of the poor in the book of Luke that you find running throughout both Luke and Acts. I think of the book of Acts where there's concern over the proper treatment of widows and to make sure that they are supported by the community of faith. It's not that that's the only thing that's there, but it's certainly there. And we find it in the Magnificat as well. So I, again, am in the Magnificat. I'm on page 1831, Luke chapter 1, verses 46 to 55. Look at verse 48. "For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Surely from now on all generations will call me blessed." Look at verse 52. "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." So in verse 48, we see the servant that Mary refers to is herself. So in the first part, as I mentioned in an earlier talk, the focus of Mary's praise is on what God has done for her. But in the latter part of the Magnificat, it's what God is doing for his people, right? So one of the things that God is doing through lifting Mary up is lifting the people up, is lifting those who are lowly up. And I don't think the Bible really necessarily talks about them displacing, because what do we know about those that go from nothing to a lot, from poor to rich? Well, they just, they end up doing many of the same things that the rich have always done, right? And I'm not, please don't misunderstand me, I'm not in any way criticizing people that have means. That's not my point here, but it is my point that we should wake up and read the text for what it is and don't necessarily interpret Luke in the light of Matthew. So when Luke talks about the poor or the lowly, it's not this poor in spirit idea necessarily that Matthew's talking about. Luke is talking about a physical reality where people are poor. So when we think about what Magnificat is telling us here, I think one of the things that it's telling us is that spirituality should not be separated from our ethics. Ethics and spirituality certainly are not the same things, but they're not totally distinct either. How we treat others has an impact on the way we relate to the divine. Let me say that again. How we treat others has an impact on the way we relate to the divine. When I see the image of God, Latin, imago Dei, when I see others as bearers of, recipients of, participants of the image of God, just like I am, that has this kind of democratizing effect. It has this effect of leveling the playing field. And I think that's what is going on here in the Magnificat. It is a call for leveling the playing field. How we treat others, even difficult people. And I know if you've nursed longer than for say 24 hours, that you've had difficult patients to deal with. I've had difficult parishioners to deal with. I've had difficult students to deal with. We all get our share of difficult people to deal with. We just hope that we're not actually that difficult person ourselves, right? How we relate to others impacts the way we relate to God. Jesus says, if we love those who love us, this is Matthew chapter 5, verses 46 and 47, we're not really doing anything special. In Jesus' terms in Matthew 5, that's what the Gentiles do. And the Gentiles are those that are outside of this community of faith, right? So how we treat others impacts that relationship with the divine. So if you are a person of faith, if you are a person for whom spirituality is important, we can't, segment over here our spirituality. And this is how this is me and Jesus. This is how I relate to God. And that has to impact how we relate to others, and everybody says that, right? But what we don't think about sometimes is how we relate to others impacts this relationship. How we relate to others impacts our ability to communicate with the divine, to listen to God, to experience God. Jesus actually said, if you forgive, then it'll be forgiven. Comes with a pretty hefty price tag. If I want to be forgiven by God, I need to forgive others. I think Jesus knew that that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Sometimes forgiveness is hard, but forgiveness is always worth it. Forgiveness over very difficult circumstances, I don't want to minimize that. I don't want to minimize the hurt that humans can do to one another. But neither do I want to minimize the power of forgiveness and the impact that has on our spirituality, but then also on our lives as we try to be ethical people. If my ethic is dominated by a commitment to love one another, that means that in some sense I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to murder somebody or not. If I love them, I'm not going to do that. If I love someone, I'm not going to steal from them. That kind of thing, right? So ethics, spirituality seems to me to be tied together in this emphasis on God's work on behalf of the poor here in the Magnificat. So we'll come back in just a moment and we'll talk about a related topic, and that's the topic of mercy.